Good afternoon and happy Monday. It is me, Khali, your resident host for the coffee chat. I hope you guys are well rested. You had an amazing long weekend. And to the youth, I hope you guys thoroughly enjoyed your holiday. So, we're going to start it straight from the gate. We are going to be discussing commercial property today with a seasoned property investor and property practitioner who also is an expert in commercial property, and that's going to be Jade Barkhazen. But because Jade is just, so amazing, unfortunately, he will not be joining us for the full hour of our coffee chat. And unfortunately, he has to be leaving at 1:30. However, we are going to utilize all of his knowledge and we are going to extrapolate everything that we can from him. But ladies and gentlemen, as always, tell me where you're watching us from, and please also let me know in the chat box if this is your first time watching the coffee chat. I want to know how you found out about Sapin, and if you do not know anything about Sapin, this is your first time, also let me know in the chat box. However, we are going to get straight to it and help me welcome Jade Barkhazen. Jade, how are you, sir? So Jade seems to be disconnected just for a quick one, but that's fine. We'll just get him back on. As I said, Jade he's too amazing. He's here, there, and everywhere. But like I said, we are going to be discussing commercial property. Is it still viable? We have a lot of people working from home. We have a lot of people doing hybrid. We have shared working spaces. So now we need to actually unpack commercial property and industrial property and actually find out, as an investor, as a property entrepreneur, are those still viable angles of property investment? So I do see, as always, Eric is contacting us from Cape Town. So let me know if this is your first time watching us on the coffee chat. And if you've ever heard of Sapin, where did you hear about us from? So I just want you to let me know where you're going to be watching us from. And also, as we're busy still getting Jade back on the line, I want you guys to have all of your questions in the chat box, because remember I did say that he has another interview with a prominent station a little later on. So unfortunately, he can't be with us for the full hour of our coffee chat. So put all of your questions in there for Jade in terms of anything and everything that pertains to commercial property. Like I said, we have shared working spaces now. We have hybrid work from home. We have so many ways that people are now moving and living where not everybody wants to be in, a dense city kind of a setup. There's different ways where people can work remotely. So we want to know, as investors, is commercial property still viable? How do you finance it? Because you can't just go to the bank and get a home loan. These buildings are worth millions and millions. Even if we're looking at it from an angle of a development or straight up you're buying a property out the gate, we need to know, commercial property, is it still viable? Conversions, is it feasible for you to do conversions, or are we going to go back to the normalcy of having commercial properties, or do we want to do hybrids where people reside in the building at which they live on? And I do believe that we do have Jade back. So Jade, kind sir, how are you this afternoon?
Hi there, Khali. Thanks for having me. I'm very well, thank you, and welcome to all the listeners.
Fantastic. So I was asking people to let me know where they're from and if this is the first time they've heard of us. However, I also asked them to ask all of the questions in terms of commercial property, as in, is it still viable? Is it still lucrative? And I know you are a seasoned expert because you are a practicing property practitioner in the commercial space. Like I said, the first question, Jade, out the gate, is it still a viable investment to invest in commercial property?
Yes, Khali, so that's obviously quite a wide or general question, and I think the answer is absolutely yes. If you're investing in the right type of property in the right type of area, then absolutely. In fact, I don't think it doesn't matter what happens with the economy, there'll always be good commercial property investments out there. You just need to understand what the risks are that's involved with that specific type of property. And of course, having the correct or the right and strong tenants is absolutely essential, both in residential and commercial. But we'll get a little bit more into talking about commercial property now. But the short answer, yes.
Okay. So we do have, like, ladies and gentlemen, an expert of commercial property wants to say. Now, coming into the point I was making, that people are working hybrid, right? There's shared working spaces, there's hybrid. So you do want to develop, or rather you do want to still invest in commercial property. Would you say there's now a niche market for commercial property, or is the standard way that commercial property has always operated still lucrative right now?
So, Khali, what's nice about commercial property is there's such a wide variety of the types of properties you can invest in. From hotels to malls to mixed use buildings where you've got commercial at the bottom, residential at the top. Even blocks of flats, those are seen as commercial properties and not residential or Res 1 type properties. So there's such a wide variety and there's always so much opportunity. As you mentioned, conversions, and that's always an opportunity. In fact, it's something I'm looking at the moment, is finding even a small office block and converting it into residential in an area where there's a high demand. Now, when I say convert into residential, the property will still be seen out of a financier's point of view as a commercial property, even though it's a residential property, so it's being used for residential. So we often look at how the banks will finance a property, and that will then indicate to us whether the banks will see it as commercial or as residential. During the COVID period, and in fact now still, we saw a big uptick especially in the Eastern Cape, with logistics companies. Warehousing was very popular. Of course, countrywide, I think office space took the biggest hit out of all the different types of commercial property as well as retail. And we're slowly seeing office space coming back, although smaller sizes. That's what I've seen in the market. The big companies aren't taking these massive office spaces anymore. It's a bit smaller. Some staff are working from home, others are working from the offices. But the general trend has been a little bit of an uptick towards office space again, which is nice to see.
Okay, that's very interesting that you mentioned it, because it's one of the questions actually, from Eric. And as I said, please guys, put your questions in the chat box, because we are only having Jade up until 1:30, because he's extra amazing and everybody, wants a piece of him. But this pertains to a question that Eric asked, and I was going to ask you too, in terms of what kind of commercial properties are there? You mentioned warehousing, you mentioned industrial. So what are the different kinds of commercial properties out there?
So, yeah, Eric, to answer your question, it's a very difficult one, because you really need to choose as an investor what niche you want to go into. Is that office space? Is it retail? Is it warehousing? Is it industrial type of space? And I think as a starting point, if you're wanting to get involved in commercial property, I'd say start smaller than bigger. Okay, because there's less risk for your smaller type of properties. Whether it's a small retail space that you purchase that's only 50 square meters, or maybe it's a residential block of flats, which is also seen as commercial. That might be something you go after. But I think it's essential for you to understand the driving factors behind the type of property you're investing in. That's always important, right? So it's quite difficult to say, but if you find the right building with the right tenant, even office space can be a really good investment. With commercial property, typically you can sign 10 or 15-year leases, even with national or international tenants. Now, if you find a building with a tenant like that, that could be a really solid investment. So it's a very difficult question to answer. In my specific area where I am in PE or Gqeberha, I would probably look at investing in small warehousing from 100 square meters up to 300 square meters. That's where we're seeing a very big demand. Small businesses love those type of spaces. But where you live in your area, you need to do that homework. That might not work up in Joburg where you guys are. You might want to go for something bigger, or is it a block of flats? So I hope that helps.
And so Puma wants to know, says, hi Jade, awesome to see you again. Briefly just touch on the trend of turning commercial property buildings who were office spaces into residentials. Are there any guidelines there?
Yeah, so Puma, thanks for that, and good question. I particularly like this type of deal because I think you can unlock so much value. There's a lot of buildings out there that, because office space hasn't come quite back to where it used to be, there's a lot of vacancies in offices still across the country. And if you can pick a property up below market value and do that conversion, that's where you can actually make some real good money with property. So some things that will come into play is you'll have to see what zoning the property has. You also have to have building plans drawn up. So if you're converting an office block and you want to then convert into residential, into say ensuite studio apartments, you'd need to follow the whole process of possibly either rezoning, or you would need to definitely have plans drawn up by an architect, have a chat to a town planner, because you'd have to find out how many people you can actually have in that building. And then the whole thing comes into play where you've got to get quotes on the renovations or the redevelopment of the property, run a full feasibility to make sure that the rental income you're going to get after the redevelopment is actually going to make sense. There's companies such as Tough. They're actually one of our sponsors at South African Property Investors Network. They actually work with you with these kind of things. They love inner city buildings, and they love doing those conversions and helping you with those conversions. So get your power team in place. So architect, town planner, those are two very important individuals. That's probably where you want to start. And from there, they will advise you and you'll take the next step. You'll get someone like a quantity surveyor involved as well. They can do the actual costing of the redevelopment for you. And then you'll have to submit all of this to the financing company. If you're not buying cash, you'd have to submit that pretty much almost like a business plan. And then you'd approach the funders with that.
And interesting how you mentioned funders, because I wanted now to also, as our viewers are watching us, how does one get financing for commercial property? Because obviously buying a warehouse or a factory is probably not the same as buying, a nice little sectional title or a freestanding home. So what would the guidelines be in terms of getting financing for commercial property?
So Khali, a couple of very important things. Firstly, typical commercial loans are over a 10-year period. Okay, there are sometimes change with that. That's your typical loan period, which is 10 years. And your interest is also usually higher than a residential loan. So a residential loan you might be able to pick up, or a home loan you might be able to pick up at prime interest rate. Commercial will typically be 1 to 1.5% higher than that. And remember, because you're paying your loan off over 10 years, your monthly repayment is going to be much higher. With residential, you're paying off over 20 years typically, so your monthly repayment is lower. So the banks will also typically loan up to 70% and I'm talking about a standard commercial property. There are obviously companies like Tough that specialize in commercial property loans as well. They can typically loan over a 15-year period, so it gives you a little bit of breathing space in terms of cash flow. And up to 80%, sometimes even 100% if you're the right individual. But your commercial property loans, 70%, which means that you need to have a 30% down payment as a deposit, plus your costs. Remember, you got to pay the transferring attorney, the bond registration attorney, as well as your deposit. So if you're buying R1 million commercial property, you might get a 700,000 Rand loan from the bank. You have to put down 300,000 as a deposit, plus your attorney fees. So you might need 400 or 450,000 Rand cash in your bank account in order to buy commercial property. And Khali, that's why a lot of people struggle to get into commercial property, because they might not have that deposit available. But what you do see is a lot of the big business people, they'll always be investing in commercial. And there's various reasons for that. One of them being that typically commercial properties are valued based on its net income and not on comparable sales like in residential property. And I think that's probably the biggest distinguishing factor between residential and commercial.
So when we're talking about that, I see Eric also had a question that you briefly touched on when he was asking, like, are there better regions for commercial property where it's a lot more viable in these specific areas? Or is it just a matter of you do your research and you find out what kind of commercial property would probably work best for your region?
Yeah, Khali, I think it's really just about doing your homework. Speak to a lot of commercial brokers, because commercial brokers, obviously like myself, we deal with businesses every day. We place businesses into different types of properties. So typically they'll know what is in a high demand area and what is a high demand type of property. And it's very difficult for me to say the whole South Africa warehousing is a good investment, right? So you need to look at your specific area and what the needs are. As I said, like in PE, for instance, we had a massive uptick for logistics companies in particular. So warehousing would have been a great investment because their businesses were just growing and growing. But in your specific area, maybe office space conversions, maybe mixed use buildings, that's often a type of investment that I quite like, because at the bottom you might have commercial properties that are quite strong tenants, and at the top you'll have residential. And that just sort of offsets the risk a little bit. If you've got multiple tenants, that's often also a better way to go, as opposed to having one single tenant, because if that tenant's business folds or something happens, you're sitting with an empty building. So perhaps look at doing multi-tenanted buildings, just to manage your risk a little bit.
Okay, that's actually quite interesting in terms of understanding and managing your risks. As you were talking, Kuma had another question where he was asking, when building a commercial property near townships, whether a warehouse or a mall, how important is it to engage with the nearby community members?
I'd say it's quite essential, Khali. I think you need to involve the community members, and a story jumps to mind. In Seppen, we've got an expert in commercial property development, specifically malls in South Africa, Mark Berman. He's been involved in many, building of malls, and he told us the story of, how they went into sort of a lower income area, and before they started building, they engaged with the community members because they wanted to find out, what is the demand, what do they need, and various permissions, because there might be informal traders in the area that sort of don't want a new mall to be going up. So I think it's essential to engage with the community before you start building this massive mall. So Kuma, I hope that helps.
Mm-hmm. So, just a few more questions before I let you go. You mentioned that with commercial property, unlike the standard residential property, you have something called anchor tenants. So it would be somebody who, has a lease for like 10, 15 years, whereas obviously in residential, the standard is a year. And then it's up for revision. In terms of those kinds of leases, how long can like a commercial lease be? Is there a timeline for it?
Yeah, there's really no timeline, Khali. What we see in the industry mostly is between, I'd say, 3 to 10 years. That's sort of your typical lease period. I've seen longer as well. I've seen 20-year leases, depending on the type of business. And commercial leases are different to residential leases. Oftentimes with commercial property, we get something that you call a triple net lease, which essentially is, as a landlord, you can pass over most of the costs of that property, you can pass on to the tenant. Even rates and taxes, maintenance, levies, everything you can put onto the tenant. Now, that's not the case with every single commercial lease, but a lot of your bigger leases are triple net leases, which is really a win for the landlord, because really he's got almost no costs except for his finance costs on the property. It's also a little bit easier to evict commercial tenants as opposed to residential. It's easier to get rid of them. That's also, I think, why a lot of big investors do like the commercial space. With residential, if you've got children involved, families involved, it's a bit more difficult to evict them and just put them on the street. Businesses are a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. So we have Jonathan. He wants to know. Says, "Hi Jade, have you dealt with government leases, and what are your thoughts? Secure but good pairs?"
Yeah. So, Jonathan, good question. For instance, the post office, I had a landlord where the post office was renting for him for many, many years, and as a lot of you guys probably know, many of the post offices around the country have closed. So, they owed him a substantial amount of money. So I wouldn't say that government tenants are always the most secure. I guess it depends what department and how long they've been there, and how things are going in the country. But typically, investors that buy buildings with government tenants, like the municipality, for instance, they are seen as quite secure still. But I think it's important to still do your homework, because just because you've got a government tenant doesn't mean that they're always going to be paying rent. So
Very, very
I hope that helps, Jonathan.
Yes, that's very true. So, like I said, just before we let you go, I have one more question in terms of commercial properties. In that, how difficult is it to do a conversion versus a development? So, if we're saying starting a commercial property from scratch, what level of difficulty is that versus buying a warehouse and maybe converting it to retail space, or buying, an office space and converting it to residential? Which one would you say is probably a little bit more feasible?
Khali, so I can't really say that one's more feasible than the other. What I can say is that converting an existing building, if you want to, if you want to look at the difficulty level and the risk level, it's probably a little bit easier to convert an existing building. Building a building from scratch there's a lot more moving parts. There's more people that need to be involved. You might have to have structural engineers. You might have to have traffic engineers. You might have to do geotechnical studies on the land. There's so much extra that comes with building a building from scratch. Okay, it's not to say it's not a good investment. It's not to say it's not a great opportunity. But if you're starting out, and I think an existing building is easier. So you got to draw up your plans. You might have to rezone, but the building's already standing there. You don't need to have environmental impact studies and those kind of things done. Um, so I would say convert an existing building, but I've met a lot of investors that actually have a very, very good tenant lined up, and they build a property specifically for that tenant's needs. So, for instance, a big company, let's say it's a Checkers or a Spar or a Pick and Pay, and a landlord finds out that, geez, they want to open another branch in an area, and they could then sign a lease agreement and build that property to spec on behalf of the tenant. Now, in that case, it's a great option to start to build from scratch because you've already got the tenant lined up. So yeah, I hope that helps. Kelly, just another thing I want to mention on commercial property. I mentioned that the value is based typically on the net income. So for investors, what is really great about a commercial property is if you can increase the net income. So either increase the income or decrease the expenses, or both. The value of the property automatically goes up. Okay, whereas residential, you might renovate a kitchen and a bathroom and you spend 300,000 Rand doing that. It doesn't mean that 300,000 Rand is automatically added to the value of your residential property. But if you increase the income on a commercial property and your net income, the value of your property goes up immediately. And also with your longer term leases, because there's escalations in the leases, let's say there's a 10% escalation, the value of your property over a 5-year period in that lease will go up substantially based on the net income. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. It's quite important.
Quite interesting. And here's a very interesting question from Eric as we close off with you. Eric wants to know, and I'd never actually thought about this, is can you subdivide a commercial building between res and commercial and then refinance the res part of it via a bond over 20 years?
So Eric, that's a really good question, but I think in fact you can do that. But I think when you do that, you won't be able to refinance on a residential bond. I don't think you'll get a 20-year loan period once you've redeveloped that property. Sorry, I'm just reading the question again. Can you subdivide a commercial building between res and commercial? So it depends what the building is. Maybe it's a full residential block, and you want to now add commercial to that. You can maybe make the bottom floor commercial. The banks will then typically see that building as a commercial building, and they'll finance on a commercial loan. In fact, if it was a full residential building, you probably wouldn't be able to get a home loan on it anyway, because the banks will still see it as a commercial property. So he says, so top floor is res. Yeah, so if the top floor is res and the bottom is either res or commercial, the banks will typically see it from a commercial loan perspective, and you probably won't be able to get a home loan on that property. Once again, it's a case by case thing, so you need to see what the building is. I've seen 1 or 2 home loans being given on student accommodation properties, which is typically not what banks do, but sometimes you can get away with it. So Eric, it depends what the building is, what the current zoning is of the building. The bank will always look at that. If it's a business 1 zone property, you typically will not get a home loan on that. But a building like that probably wouldn't ever have residential 1 zoning which is usually what you need for a home loan.
And as we say goodbye, I do understand you are still part of an amazing development, Crossways. Just do you mind just giving us a little bit information about that just before you go?
Yeah, sure, Khali. So yeah, my partners and I, we're currently building 5 houses, and Eric's quite familiar with the development. We're currently building 5 houses and flipping them. So we are still in the process of raising funds to complete those houses. And one of them has already been sold. In fact, it looks like we're getting another offer on a second one, and they're not complete yet, which is really exciting. So if any investors are out there and they're wanting to chat to me about possibly getting involved in that deal, please feel free to reach out to me or to Khali and just get my details.
Awesome, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jade, for that, and also answering all the questions regarding commercial property, because it's with Copy Chat, we literally enter all the property space. So from us to you, I want to say thank you so much for that, Jade. And you guys still stay tuned because there's quite a few things that I do want to be discussing. But thank you so much, Jade.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Khali. Cheers, guys.
Awesome. Alrighty then, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be discussing our events. There's quite a few things happening, and the first one I want to talk about is Investor of the Year. I did ask you earlier on if this is your first time watching me on Coffee Chat or watching the Coffee Chat, and if it's the first time you've heard of something, that's perfectly fine. We will definitely be hanging out a lot more, but the main thing I want to talk about is Investor of the Year. Have you guys entered? I know you've watched us every single week. You might have your first ever investment property. It really does not matter. We have enough categories where your little 1 bedroom sectional title, it is worthy of entering. So I want you guys to honestly enter the Investor of the Year awards. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact support at SA Properties Investors Network. Next, we are going to be having a cash flow game a day, and that's going to be happening on the 30th of June. I'm not sure if you guys were here for the first one. It was super fun, and that's just for the youth and people just learning about financial literacy. It's super fun, and it's just a few hours. We engage with different people and you network in a different way instead of the standard. After that, on the 21st of June, we're going to be having our coaching and legal webinar. That's going to be happening at 6 o'clock on the 21st of June. And also, this was one we are excited about. Everybody who is in Pietermaritzburg and Durban, Andrew Walker, yes, the CEO, is going to be joining you guys for a networking event. The tickets right now are still early bird tickets, so you can get them. That's going to be on the 22nd of June, and that's going to be happening at the Redlands Hotel. So you please get your tickets for that event. We're going to be discussing what property strategies to use in the current KZN market. Outside of that, Investor of the Year awards, that happens bi-weekly, so please enter Investor of the Years. And if you don't enter, I'll just call you, because I know who you are and I know that you guys are always watching. So you shall be called and you shall be told to enter, because there's really nothing to lose. If anything, you could potentially extend your property portfolio substantially by winning it, because that's the whole point. There is a chance for you to win. So I don't understand why you are risk adverse and a property investor. It doesn't work. However, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully I will see you again next week. And from me to you, it is good afternoon.